Hi everyone, welcome to the session. Um, so if we want to do well on the assessment, first we need to understand why the assessment is set the way it is. Um, a lot of your previous assessments and still some of the assessments you have to do um, are essay based, or they're examinations, or they're perhaps case reports and things like that. They're essentially assessing your ability to communicate in a written way. So to assess your ability to communicate scientific information and communicate your understanding of topics, but communicate that information through text. This assessment is slightly different because a significant portion of this assessment is communicating through a poster, which is partially text, but it's also visually. It's based on the visual elements, so you're going to have a lot more figures, you're going to have a lot more diagrams. The aesthetics of the poster overall are going to matter, the colours, just how it looks is going to matter because it's a different way of communicating. It's more about the visual than about the text. You're also going to be communicating through explaining the poster. So we're going to be assessing verbal communication because that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be recording a 5 to 7 minute audio accompaniment in which you explain the poster and discuss the poster, and you essentially present the poster. So in the past, you've often been assessed on your ability to communicate through written language. This assessment, there's a slightly different angle. So you're going to be assessed through your ability to communicate via a poster, which includes written language and also a heavy emphasis on figures and diagrams and all these other visual elements. And you're also going to be assessed on your ability to communicate verbally. And again, that's the portion of the assessment where you're explaining the poster, where you're discussing the poster. That's the 5 to 7 minute audio accompaniment. So that's just a little bit of context for the poster. So just think about that. Think about how you're going to be communicating in a slightly different way. The fundamental kind of underlying things we're assessing are your ability to understand science, your understanding of the topic, your ability to discuss, your ability to assess primary papers and evaluate on all these different scientific principles that are the same as the other assessments. It's just the way we're assessing it that's different. So we still need to know that you understand the topic. We still need to know that you can read and understand primary literature. We still need to understand that you can discuss scientific concepts. It's just you're communicating those things to us differently. You're not communicating them through an essay or through an exam answer, and you're communicating them verbally and also through the poster. And just for some examples, these are the things you're evidencing when you're presenting the poster. So you're presenting the poster and you're communicating with us. So what are we expecting you to communicate? First off, we're expecting you to communicate your understanding and knowledge of the poster and also the topic itself. So you want to know you actually understand these things. You actually know what you're talking about in a real level of depth. And this is where the wider context comes in. So it's not enough to just understand the content of the poster. You need to communicate to us that you understand the wider context and you understand that the particular infectious disease you're talking about exists in the context of other things and of socioeconomic aspects, of other infectious diseases, of cultural elements and things like that. So again, we're assessing your ability to communicate these things verbally. We're also assessing your ability to communicate these things and things like them through the poster itself. So there's significant support available for you. This is part of the support. So this support session that I'm recording now, I'll also be looking at a draft for each student. So I'd like you to submit a draft of your poster to me by email by the date on the slide, so by February the 8th at 2 p.m. I don't want this submission to have any audio accompaniment. I just want it to be a slide. So I just want it to be the poster itself, ideally as a slide, as a PowerPoint slide. And then I can look at that and give you some feedback on that. I'm not able to listen to the audio accompaniments for every student because it's a big module, and I'm just not able to do that. But I am happy to look at the poster and make sure everyone is hopefully on track with the poster. And what I'll do is send you an email back or arrange a meeting in which I discuss your poster, and again give you some feedback, tell you what I think you should change, give you a bit of advice, and then you'll be free to go away and act on that. If you miss this deadline, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. Just submit it to me as soon as possible after this deadline, and I'll still try and get it back to you. If you miss this deadline, I might not be able to get it back to you. There's no guarantee I'll get it back to you, but the sooner you get it to me after this deadline, the more likely I'll be able to get it back. It depends on how many other people miss the deadline. It depends on how late you get it to me after the deadline. So I will try and look at it. I'm not going to ignore any drafts just because they're after the deadline. But I've deliberately set this deadline to give myself enough time to look at the drafts. So if I get a large number of drafts after this deadline, I'm not going to get to look at them all, basically. So I'd encourage you to submit before this deadline, and then I can guarantee that I'll be able to look at your draft and get you feedback. And then, I can either give you the feedback by email, or we can arrange to discuss on Teams. There's other sources of support at the university as well. So things like study skills through the library. These are really, really useful. If you're second language English, I'd also encourage you to access study skills. They have some resources specifically targeted towards students who are second language English. It's difficult for students who are second language English. I know it's like there's an extra barrier. And study skills they're really good at helping students deal with that. So again, I'd encourage you to access that support. And as always, if you are unable to submit for whatever reason, there's resources on the module space that can guide you towards options that you may have, mitigating circumstances, deferrals, extensions, and things like that. So if you're unable to submit and there's a valid reason, then I'd encourage you to look at these resources. Okay, so onto the topic. So hopefully I've laid a bit of context down and we're clear about what the idea of the assessment is. The idea of the assessment is you're communicating verbally and through the poster itself. So what are you communicating? Now, we talked about you're communicating your ability to evaluate, your ability to discuss, your understanding of the topic, all these different things. So obviously the topic is important. So what is this topic we're talking about? It's up to you, essentially, as long as you pick the topic from a list on the module space. So I've put a list of infectious diseases on the module space, and what you need to do is pick any single one of those infectious diseases, and that infectious disease you've chosen is the topic of your poster. And you'll see this is clearly outlined in the assessment brief. I'm asking you to pick a single infectious disease from the list on the module space. It's quite a long list, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, students love the choice. They love to have all the different options. And I think that's understandable. I'd rather you pick a topic that's appropriate for you than pick a topic that you don't really have an inherent interest in. So I think all that choice is good. But I'm also aware the choice can be a little bit overwhelming. So one of the things I want to do today is provide you with a bit of advice on picking a specific topic. Okay, so there are a few questions you can ask yourself that will help guide you towards an appropriate topic. So again, at this point, you should have accessed the infectious disease list on the module space, and you should be at least in a position where you're ready to pick a specific topic. The way to do this, again, is to think about these specific questions. You might not find these helpful. You might have already picked a topic, or you might look at the list and immediately think of one. See one that appeals to you. Absolutely fine. But if you're struggling, then this may be useful. Firstly, I bear in mind that you want to pick an infectious disease that is interesting to you. So you want to pick an infectious disease that you have an interest in. The reason for that is fairly simple. If you're interested in it, then you're going to have an inherent motivation to learn about it. You're going to have motivation to read about it. You're going to have motivation to put time into the assessment because you have an interest there. I don't want you to be bored while doing this assessment, and that doesn't really benefit anyone. So it really is in your interest to pick an infectious disease that you find interesting. So some students will look at the list and they will come in with the mindset of which infectious disease will help me do best, which infectious disease will people get the highest mark doing. That's not how the assessment works. So students can do equally well regardless of the infectious disease they pick, kind of at a cohort level. So students who score highly pick a whole range of the different ones. Students who score towards the bottom of the scale, they pick a whole range as well. So there's no correlation between the infectious disease picked and the outcome and the grade given. There's just no correlation there, so that's really not something you should be thinking about. The first thing you should be thinking about, as I said, is whether the infectious disease is interesting to you. Secondly, once you start researching the disease, you want to be thinking about whether you actually understand it. So for various reasons, students just find different infectious diseases easier to understand or more difficult to understand. I think some students just have, a bit of a knack for either bacteriology or virology or mycology, and I think that's just the way it is. I just think we all have this slight preference for different areas within science, and I think that's true within infectious diseases as well. So maybe you just feel a slight affinity towards viral infections over bacterial infections, or fungal infections over viral infections. Whatever it is, don't make life hard for yourself by picking an infectious disease that you struggle to understand. Again, there's no real benefit to that. So I'd encourage you to pick an infectious disease that not only is interesting to you, but also that makes sense to you. So you're making your pathway, quite clear. You're not making it needlessly difficult for yourself. Following on from this, we have to think about the literature as well. So the literature relating to, so first off, we have literature relating to infectious disease as a whole, which is medical microbiology. But then when we start getting into the details of specific infectious diseases, we see we have literature relating specifically to viral infectious diseases, and then also to bacterial infectious diseases, and then parasitic infectious diseases, so the parasitic worms and things like that. And we have these different kind of subsets of medical microbiology, and you may find different subsets easier to navigate. So you find the literature in particular subsets easier to navigate. I've studied viruses for a long time and I research viruses, so I find the literature relating to viral infections quite easy to navigate, usually, not always, but I read it a lot, so it feels I'm comfortable reading it. The literature around, say, fungal diseases is quite different to the literature around viral diseases, and I find that just a little bit trickier to read. I find there's just a slight barrier, just because I don't read it as much, just because it's not the area of science that I did my PhD in and that I do my research in. So it just doesn't quite feel as, I don't feel as at home as I do when I'm reading viral literature. And you may well feel the same. You may well feel the same in the sense that you feel literature relating to bacteriology just makes a little bit more sense to you. You pick it up quicker. You understand the concepts quicker. Again, think about that when you're picking the infectious disease. You ideally want to be operating in an area where you're as comfortable as you can be. So again, don't make the situation any more complicated for yourself than it is already, really. Finally, you want to be thinking about your long-term goals. So you could potentially at this point be thinking about masters or PhDs or entering into research. And this isn't putting any pressure on you to think about these things. It's just, you know, it's potentially your next step, really. You're in the final year of your degree, so you're probably thinking about what to do next. If you're thinking about going into research, looking at a particular infectious disease, or you're interested in a PhD studying a particular infectious disease, or even a field within medical microbiology, so you're thinking about going down a pathway where you're looking at bacterial infectious diseases, this is an opportunity for you to tailor the module towards your interests. So if you're interested in going down a route, you're interested in pursuing bacterial infectious diseases, then you should probably pick a bacterial infectious disease for this assessment, because then when you're applying for masters, when you're applying for PhDs, when you're applying for jobs, you can say, I have a really, really good understanding of this particular infectious disease, which is caused by a bacteria. And I have a really good understanding because I produced this poster that demonstrates this understanding. If you want to see this poster, here it is, because obviously you're going to have your poster saved. So yeah, just another thing to think about. If you can pick a topic that's going to benefit you down the line, then surely it's a good idea. Here is just a small flow chart to help you kind of apply those questions that I've just mentioned to a kind of practical way of picking your question. So the first thing you need to do is select a disease based upon some of the criteria we've talked about. So you're looking at the infectious disease, then your infectious disease list, and you're selecting one. Then you need to start looking into the pathogenesis and epidemiology. So these are the core fundamental aspects of the infectious disease. So you're understanding what the infectious disease is. If you do this successfully and you don't really have any significant problems, then you can move on to think about diagnostic and interventions. Diagnostics and interventions. And what you're doing here again is just expanding your understanding of the infectious disease, just making sure you're able to understand the infectious disease and the related issues. Then you want to go into the primary literature. So then you want to be going on PubMed, reading not just reviews, because I imagine you would have been reading reviews when looking at pathogenesis and epidemiology, and also diagnostics and interventions. What you want to be doing now is looking at primary literature. So looking at the literature that have actually done the experiments, that have produced the data, and they're reporting this data. If you understand this literature, and again, you feel you're comfortable and you don't have any huge regrets about the infectious disease you've picked, then you can start putting the posters together. Again, the way I've constructed this, this kind of flow chart, is that if at any point you don't feel super comfortable, if at any point you do feel a regret over the infectious disease you've picked, you can just go straight back to the beginning and pick another one, because again, constructing the poster is, you know, at the end of this flow chart. What I'd strongly encourage you to do is work on this week. So by the end of this week, I'd really like individuals to be at a point where they are constructing the poster, where they are starting to construct the poster. Because if you follow this checklist and then you start constructing the poster, then you shouldn't reach a part in the poster where you suddenly go, oh, I've picked the wrong infectious disease, because this process should have taken care of that. Because you're not going to be constructing the poster, then suddenly come to the epidemiology part of the poster and realize you don't understand it. Or you're not going to start reading primary literature when you're halfway through the poster and realize, oh, I don't understand this at all. And then be in a really sticky situation, really. So ideally, to be on track, it would be great if this week, and if not this week, soon, you could have used these criteria to have picked an infectious disease, and then be in a position where you are ready to start the poster, and you are comfortable with the topic you've picked, and you should not have any unforeseen significant barriers that are going to prevent you from producing the poster. Okay, and just to essentially summarize what I've said so far, any infectious disease on the list is an acceptable topic. However, you can maximize your own potential by picking an infectious disease that is appropriate for your background, your understanding, and your interests. Okay, so that's the topic covered. What I want to do now is discuss the marking criteria. So I haven't put up the actual marking criteria document yet. So I actually have a PDF which contains the the physical marking criteria the assessors will be using, and it'll involve grading you kind of 1 to 10 on a whole range of different things. I am going to put that marking criteria up on the module space eventually, just because I think it's so useful for you. It seems fair to me that you have as much information as we can give you about how you're being graded and what you're being assessed on. I want you to do well in this assessment, and I think a big part of you doing well is understanding how we're assessing you, right? If you don't really understand how you're being assessed, then it's almost not quite fair for this assessment, because it's quite a specific assessment, and I'm asking you to record a 5 to 7 minute audio, which is actually quite short if you compare it to, 4,000 word essay or something like that. So yeah, I want it to be 100% clear what we're grading you on. So I'm going to put the marking criteria on the module space soon. When we're discussing the marking criteria, it's really important we note that we can essentially split the way the assessment is marked. So we have mark awarded for the poster itself, and the poster itself should be a standalone submission. What I mean by that is, if someone is reading the poster and looking for the poster, it should be understandable. It should speak for itself. It should be a complete submission. Then we have a portion of the mark awarded for the accompanying audio. So you're asked to submit a 5 to 7 minute audio recording over the poster, and in that 5 to 7 minute audio recording, you're explaining the poster, you're discussing the poster, you're providing extra information, and a portion of the marks will be awarded for that audio as well. So the poster itself and the accompanying audio are both really important. They're submitted as one file. So the poster is submitted with the audio recorded on top of the poster. However, the poster itself should be understandable. It should be clear, even without the audio. So one issue we have is sometimes students will submit a poster that is just bullet points or super minimal information that doesn't make any sense unless the audio is explaining it. That's not correct. The audio should enhance the poster, it should strengthen the poster, it should provide context for the poster, but it shouldn't be absolutely necessary to understand the poster. So you shouldn't absolutely have to listen to the audio to understand the poster. The poster should be self-sufficient, it should stand alone, and then the audio just strengthens it. It just adds things, it adds information, it adds context, it adds explanation. So hopefully that makes sense. And what I want to do now is work through some of the specific questions each assessor will be asking themselves while they're assessing your work. So they'll be saying, does the poster do this? Does the poster do this? Is it fulfilling this criteria, for example? So what I want to do now is look through some of the specific examples, because these are the kind of things you should be asking yourself when you're constructing the poster, because again, this is what the assessor is going to be looking for, because I'm telling you that. Okay, so firstly, is the content factually correct? So these first questions we're going to look at are relating to the poster itself, so the poster as a submission. So for this portion, we're not thinking about the audio, we're just thinking about the poster itself. So again, is the content factually correct? So is the information that's on the poster, is it true? Is it accurate? Are there mistakes on it? Are things wrong? Again, this is really important. So please, just make sure the information on there is correct. Make sure it's accurate. Make sure it's true. Make sure there aren't any mistakes. So is the text well written? Are there spelling, grammatical errors? So this is something I unfortunately see quite a lot in these posters. I set a poster at level 7 as well, so at masters, and I see it then as well, which is a real shame. For a lot of students, there'll be spelling mistakes, or there'll be grammatical mistakes. There'll be poorly worded sentences, poorly structured paragraphs, just concepts that are communicated in a really clumsy or untidy way. And it's a shame. You're at level 6, so I'm sure you're very, very capable of communicating clearly without mistakes by writing. So therefore, when I see these mistakes, it tends to just, I think, be a symptom of either carelessness or not proofreading, and those themselves can be a symptom of rushing. So when you've left an assessment too late. So I really would encourage you to give yourself sufficient time to proofread the submission, to really check you've communicated all these concepts effectively, to make sure there's no spelling mistakes, there's no missing words. Unfortunately, things like this, they do impact the effectiveness of the poster. If there's spelling mistakes, if there's missing words, if there's grammatical errors, they do impact communication, so they do impact the final mark. Okay, is the font an appropriate size? So in the assessment brief, I tell you the poster should be A1. It's tricky this year because in previous years, students have the poster printed off, so you can physically see the size. This year it's slightly different because it's just submitted online. The stipulation in terms of font size is that it should be reasonable. So I'm not going to tell you what specific font size to use because it depends on the style of the poster and things like that. However, you don't want the poster to look too cramped, so you don't want to have too much text there, that's really small, but also you don't want to have it looking too sparse and empty, so you don't want to have large text with loads of empty space. There's a balance between the two. What I've included in this presentation is a couple of posters that are good examples, not perfect examples, but good examples of how to construct these posters. And I'd really want you to note the text size there and note how it looks good. It looks like it makes sense. It's not too cramped, but it's not too spread apart. This text should also be well referenced. So the way I ask you to reference these posters is by putting a small reference list at the bottom. This reference list can be tucked away. The font can be quite small, but it needs to be on the poster. The text itself inside the poster needs to be referenced, so there needs to be in-text citations that refer to this reference list. Again, really just like you would an essay. When you're writing an essay, you reference all the information. You need to do the same thing here because it is a scientific submission. There should also be a sense of flow and direction in the poster. So when you're writing an essay, it's pretty clear that there needs to be a flow and direction. You're going from the introduction all the way through to the conclusion. So you're logically progressing through your arguments. You're logically progressing through the subsections and the topics. It's not that different for a poster. You need to start with an introduction and end in the conclusion, and you need to have a logical progression to get from point A to B, to get from the introduction to the conclusion. You need to logically progress through the subtopics, through the subsections, and with a sense of direction and with a sense of flow. The added element when we're thinking about posters is that it's not always clear which bit to read next on a poster. However, it should be. So in an essay, it's pretty clear what to read after the introduction. You just read whatever's next, and then you read all the way through, then you get to the conclusion. With a poster, however, again, it's not always clear which section comes next. So it's up to you to make sure it's as clear as it can be, to make sure the assessor isn't standing there looking at the poster, or sitting there because it's submitted online, so isn't sitting there looking at the poster and coming to the end of a section and not knowing which section to write next. you know, that's a sign of a not overly effective poster, really, isn't it? So whether you number the sections, or whether you have little arrows, or whether you just structure it in such a way that it's inherently clear which bit should be read next, however you do it, just please make sure there's a clear sense of flow and direction. Figures. So figures are super important. Generally on a poster, you'd expect a large number of figures, and these figures should be really useful. They should enhance the poster. So one of the mistakes we see on posters, which is quite disheartening, it's a shame, is students will select a really nice figure and it looks good and it's clear, the resolution is good, it fits the style of the poster, all these things that do matter. However, the figure itself doesn't add anything to the poster. So it could be, you know, a photo of a test tube, or a photo of a scientist with a syringe, or a photo of a bottle of pills. That doesn't add any value to the poster, right? A photo of a bottle of pills, that doesn't communicate any information, that doesn't strengthen any arguments, that doesn't provide any evaluation. It's just a photo that is kind of related to the poster, but it's just there for the sake of being there, and that's quite weak. So figures should definitely be included, however they should add value. For example, if you're talking about a particular viral infectious disease, if you had a diagram of the life cycle of the virus, that's excellent, as long as it's well explained, as long as it's clear, as long as it's a good figure in terms of resolution and style, fits the poster. That could be a really nice figure. Similarly, if you're talking about, you know, parasites, you have the parasitic life cycles. These could be really complicated, but if you have a nice clear figure of the parasitic life cycles, then yeah, really good. It can potentially really enhance the poster. If we're thinking about what's a good example, so just vaccination in general, a poor figure would just be, which I see surprisingly often actually, would just be a photo of someone getting an injection in the arm. It's related to vaccination, but it doesn't add any value, right? It doesn't strengthen the poster in any way. How about instead of that figure, you have a graph showing vaccination rates, and then in a particular population or something, and then in the text you're discussing that figure and you're saying why it matters, and you're saying why you specifically showed this data. That's hugely preferable over just a photo that is kind of vaguely related. So figures are super important, but don't just add figures for the sake of it. Add figures that are useful and that are valuable. Is the title clear and concise? Really simple one. Just make sure the title is clear, make sure it's concise, make sure it's appropriate. That's all I can say there. It's important you think about how the poster looks aesthetically as well. So one question you can ask is, does the poster look good, or does it look ugly? Is it easy to look at, or is it hard to look at? One thing we do see quite often is some students will use clashing colours, and often bright clashing colours, and it looks, it makes the poster difficult to look at, I'll say. So if we have a poster that has bright yellow and bright pink and bright green and bright blue, that's a really difficult poster to look at. It's not aesthetically pleasing. It's hard to concentrate on the content of the poster when you're so distracted by the jarring, clashing colours. So what I suggest students do is pick a single colour and construct a poster based on a scheme that revolves around that colour. So if we have a green colour scheme, we can have a poster that is mostly composed of 3 shades of green. So bright green, kind of a middle ground green, and then a dark green, a middle ground green, and a light green. And these are the 3 colours that you can colour most of the poster in. So you're picking 3 different shades of the same colour, and you're using those colours to construct the poster. This avoids the issue of clashes. It avoids having a poster that has these really distracting visual elements that impact communication. And again, you might be listening to this thinking, well, what does the color matter? It's science, so why does the color impact science? The answer is that part of this assessment is communication. We're not just assessing your understanding of the science, we're assessing your ability to communicate that understanding of the science and to communicate your ability to evaluate. And if your poster is really difficult to look at and difficult to look at in a way that distracts from the content, then that is impacting the communication in a negative way. And again, this just follows on from what I was just saying relating to color scheme. So is it visually pleasing overall? So color scheme is just one element of whether or not it's visually pleasing. We also want to think about the layout, the font used, and the style of text used. Just all these different things that impact whether or not the poster looks good or whether it doesn't look good and it's a bit difficult to look at. Okay, so in terms of the content itself, what do we have in the subsections? Do we have enough detail? The main problem with this is students will put very minimal information on the poster and then they'll talk around it when they're explaining the poster. Don't want you to do that, please. As we've explained, the poster should be able to stand for itself. I should be able to understand each section. There should be a good amount of information within each section. The verbal presentation complements that information. It provides additional information. However, the poster by itself should still be level 6. It should have a good amount of detail on it. It should have a valuation on it. It's not enough to provide that information in the verbal explanation. Again, the poster needs to be standalone. It needs to have a good amount of detail on it. It needs to have a valuation on it. Okay, again, references. So reference list needs to be included. The reference format, this is the key point here. So you're generally asked to do APA referencing. I'm asking you to do either APA referencing or Vancouver. So Vancouver is a numbered style. Students tend to prefer Vancouver for the poster because the numbers take up a bit less space than the names that you use for APA. Vancouver is really good for posters. So when you go to scientific conferences, you'll often see Vancouver. So I think it makes sense for us to use Vancouver here. Is the reference list legible? So I've said the reference list can be small and it can be tucked away in the corner. As long as I can read the reference list, that's okay. I need to be able to read it. With the rest of the poster, the font size should be appropriate so it doesn't look cramped. You don't want the text too small so it doesn't look great. With the reference list, we don't really care about that. It doesn't matter that it's cramped and tucked away in the corner. And you'll see this when we look at the poster examples, that the reference lists are cramped, and that's fine. Okay, is scientific language used appropriately, and are abbreviations used appropriately? So again, level 6, I'm sure you know how to use scientific language appropriately. I'm sure you understand the abbreviations that shouldn't be used. We just need you to evidence that, because this is one of the things we're going to be assessing you on. If scientific language isn't used appropriately, if abbreviations are used incorrectly, then you will lose marks. So again, please do check these things through the proofreading. Is the underlying information communicated effectively? So this is really one of the most important questions, if not the most important question really. Can we understand what's on the poster? Is it communicated effectively? It doesn't matter if you have an excellent understanding of the poster. If you don't communicate that understanding, so if we're reading the content and we don't understand, if the graphs and tables aren't clear, then we can't give you marks for that because you haven't evidenced it. You need to evidence your understanding. You need to communicate your understanding, because that's the same thing really, isn't it? If you're English second language and you think that might be a barrier, if you think it might be impacting your communication, then again, I'd encourage you to access study skills. It's really important that you get this communication right. Okay, is there evidence of evaluation? So evaluation is super important at level 6. I'm sure you've been told plenty of times by plenty of lecturers now. So it's not just enough to be descriptive. It's not enough to describe information. So let's say you're at a point where you understand the infectious disease and you've communicated that understanding of the infectious disease and you've told me all about that infectious disease through the poster. That's good. That's great. However, it's not enough. You also need to do evaluation. You also need to discuss the infectious disease in a critical way. So you understand the diagnostic test that's used for this particular infectious disease, and you've communicated that understanding through the poster. Good, but not enough. You need to evaluate it as well. What are the strengths and weaknesses of that technique? When is that technique used and when is it not used? Why is it used sometimes and not used sometimes? What other techniques are being developed? What are the barriers to the development of these techniques? So much more value in evaluating and discussing in this way than just providing information. And again, communication is important here as well, really important. If you're evaluating, but the evaluation isn't clear, it's just a bit clumsy or a bit muddy, it's just not quite clear what you're trying to say, the points you're making aren't communicated well, then obviously that's going to impact your marks. So evaluation needs to be present, and like the other content, it needs to be communicated effectively. And again, is this evaluation in depth? So evaluation is kind of this broad term, and anything that really approaches whether or not an idea has merit or value, whether it's good or bad, or kind of discusses it in context. These are all classed as evaluation. However, we can have strong evaluation and we can have weak evaluation, and generally strong evaluation is in-depth, it's insightful, it's intelligent, it's not just surface level. If you read research papers and also reviews, you will see a lot of examples of in-depth evaluation, and I've referenced a lot of these research papers and also reviews in the reference list of individual lectures that I've done this year. And you know, there's innumerable papers you can access through PubMed on infectious diseases. So I really would make sure you have an understanding of evaluation. And I know it's a skill you've developed through your degree, and I know you understand what evaluation is, and I know you understand how to evaluate. But just if you want clear examples, look at these papers and also look at the slides as well, because evaluating ideas is one of the things we do in the lectures. What are some examples? So some examples, if you go back to the slides when we're talking about control and we're talking about vaccination, we're talking about drug-based therapies, there's a couple of slides there where we really go into some of the different evaluation points that we can use to discuss these techniques, some of the strengths and weaknesses of drug-based interventions and vaccinations. Also, you know, the diagnostics lecture, we were talking about the different diagnostic strategies. We were talking about the strengths and weaknesses of these different strategies. There's loads of evaluation there. You know, for example, we're talking about serological based techniques. So we were talking about how you can diagnose by looking for antibodies. However, when we're doing that, we're working with an assumption that if an individual is infected, they will produce antibodies. And again, maybe those antibodies were produced by a previous infection, so it doesn't mean they're infected with the disease now. These are the kind of things that we need to be talking about when we're evaluating. And again, the more in depth, the better. Okay, are subheadings used? Are they appropriate? So if you look at the assessment brief, you'll see I suggest subtopics that you need to cover. They make excellent subheadings, really. So if you have a subheading for pathogenesis, then one for epidemiology, and then diagnosis, and then I think future developments. I'm not sure those are the topics. If you check on the module space, you'll see the assessment brief, and in the assessment brief it tells you the subtopics you need to cover, and again, they're great subheadings for individual sections. And then obviously you also need the introduction and the conclusion and the reference list. You also need to discuss future work in detail, so it's a real good idea to have a future work section. Ultimately, it's up to you how you structure the poster and what specific subheadings you have for each section. However, the module space has the assessment brief, which tells you what the poster as a whole should cover. So, it might be a good idea to have those subtopics as your subheadings. Okay, is the poster too text heavy? This is a problem as well. Some students will be super keen to include as much information as they can on the poster. I absolutely understand that, because you have all this evaluation, all this information you want to communicate, so you want to put it on the poster. However, if the poster is too text heavy, it impacts communication, right? If you have these massive blocks of text, just like a wall of text, which you sometimes see, unfortunately, it impacts communication. That's not a nice poster to read. That's not an easy poster to read. So communication is impacted. In that situation, what's best to do is include the key information on the poster, include the most valuable evaluation, and then when you get to a point where you're worried about too much text and you feel like you can't put more text on the poster without it being text heavy, then maybe the points you have left over you can discuss in the verbal presentation, so you can use to add to the poster to complement the discussion already on the poster. Yeah, so again, it's coming back to communication, isn't it? So if it's too text heavy, it impacts communication. And obviously on the flip side, if it's too sparse, if there's not enough text on it, then clearly that's going to impact communication. And also it's just not going to be a great poster anyway, because even if the poster is communicating the bits of information you have, if there's not much information, you're likely not going to have much evaluation, and you're not going to have a sufficient explanation of the infectious disease and all the different elements we need to explain. So you're finding that sweet spot in the middle. Okay, are bullet points and paragraphs used appropriately? So I suggest considering using bullet points. So you don't have to use bullet points. However, bullet points are a really effective way to communicate information in a kind of clear, succinct way. That definitely doesn't mean the poster should be all bullet points or even most bullet points. It just means you can break up portions of the main text with a few bullet points. Again, it's a good way to break up any blocks of text you have, rather than just having, a couple of paragraphs of chunks of information. How about breaking that information up into bullet points? Just something to think about. Okay, overall design and style. So again, it's just coming back to how the poster looks. Is it effective? Is everything cramped? Is everything too spaced out? Are the sections missing? And in terms of, is the title in the right place? Is the reference list tucked away at the bottom? Just is the design and the style appropriate? So, and is the poster effective overall? So this question really ties everything together. So overall, based on all these questions, based on the assessment brief, based on your understanding of the assessment, which I talked about at the start, is the poster effective? Does the poster fulfill the brief? Is it a good poster? Obviously, this is a super important question. It's a bit of a vague question, but the idea here is to just give you a bit of an opportunity to step back and think about, okay, does this poster work? Is it a good poster? I'm looking at my poster. If I saw this poster in a conference hall, how would I feel about it? And then we can ask, is it engaging? So again, we can think of looking at our poster in a poster hall in a conference, and we can say, in that situation, would I be engaged with this poster? Would I be inclined to go over and look at this poster and read it? If you've done everything we've asked you to do, if you've paid attention to the assessment brief, for example, and done everything I've discussed so far in this lecture, then the answer should be yes. You should have produced a poster that looks good, that is clear, that is engaging, and then that when you do engage with it is effective. So information is communicated well, it contains really useful evaluation. It's a good, strong scientific poster. And finally, you want to be absolutely sure that the poster itself fully addresses the brief. So you've been asked to do a very specific task, so the assessment is. If the poster you've produced doesn't um, doesn't address the brief, so it isn't what you've been asked to do, then obviously that's a really significant problem. And it does happen sometimes. Students will start putting the poster together and they'll get really into it and they'll get really focused, and that's absolutely great. However, sometimes they'll veer off because once they get started on the poster, they won't look at the brief again, and then they'll forget what was in the brief, or they'll just misremember a little bit of the brief, and they'll end up submitting a poster that isn't quite what we've asked for. Maybe it has a section missing, maybe it doesn't have a valuation, maybe the topic changes slightly, so they originally picked an infectious disease from the list, but then it morphs and they start talking about a slightly different disease. These are things that can happen, and I've certainly seen students miss sections that were asked to be present in the brief. So I've seen students miss things like epidemiology or pathogenesis completely off the poster. Obviously that's a huge problem because the student hasn't done what they've been asked to do. So even if it's a fantastic poster, it's incomplete, and sometimes it could potentially even be just incorrect if they haven't done what they've been asked to at all, really. So even if there's an excellent poster submitted, if the poster topic isn't on the list of infectious diseases, then that's a huge problem because they haven't done what they've been asked to do, unfortunately. So please do ensure your poster is consistent with what we've asked for in the assessment brief. Okay, so now we'll discuss the presentation portion of the assessment. So this is the 5 to 7 minute audio accompaniment that you've been asked to record over the poster, in which you discuss and present the poster. And again, these are just some questions you can ask yourself as you're completing this aspect of the submission. So firstly, are you speaking clearly? So some students will submit work and the audio accompaniment will just not be very clear. It's hard to understand. They could be speaking too fast, they could be speaking too quietly, they could just be mumbling a little bit. Please take care not to do that, because again, it's communication, isn't it? If you can't understand you, then the issue is communication. You're not communicating effectively, so just please bear that in mind. Okay, does the student understand the poster? So do you understand the poster? If it doesn't appear that the student actually understands the poster, then obviously that's a significant issue. We can't stop you just reading information, but we can usually tell. So it's pretty clear if a student is just reading information from, a source. It's not great. It's poor communication, and it's poor understanding. So we want you to be really explaining the poster, not just delivering information. So the information you're delivering should largely be, specific to your poster, in the context of the poster. So you should be saying things, oh, in this section I'm saying this, and in this figure you can see this, and blah, 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 blah. So again, you're really demonstrating your understanding of the poster. This understanding should be, detailed. So you want to see a detailed knowledge of the topic. An issue that sometimes crops up is the explanation will be quite superficial. So students will demonstrate an understanding. However, there's no real depth to that understanding. You're level 6 students now. And I know from the lectures that you understand these topics. You're able to gain an understanding of quite complicated diseases, quite complex things. So you need to communicate that understanding. And again, the knowledge that you have should be demonstrated, and that knowledge should be detailed. It shouldn't be superficial. And that's, if we think about level 4 and level 5 and level 6, that's pretty clear. I mean, if I ask the level 4 student what a particular infectious disease is, if it's an infectious disease they know, they may be able to give me an accurate explanation of that disease. So I run a level 4 microbiology module, and most of the students there, for example, will be able to tell me what a common cold is, they'll be able to tell me. And the common cold is a viral infection of the respiratory tract. And that's fine, that's accurate, that's true. However, at level 6, you'll be able to answer that same question with a lot more depth. You'll be able to explain a lot more information, particularly if you have time to prepare, which is what we're giving you for this poster. So I really want you to give me a level 6 understanding of the topic. I want you to show level 6 knowledge, not level 4 knowledge. So again, this is coming down to detailed knowledge. So outside reading is super important. It's really important that you evidence that you've been doing outside reading. So we always say that lecture content is a jumping off point, it's a starting point, and that's absolutely true. So what we're doing in lectures is discussing core topics, and ultimately we'll be discussing important infectious diseases. However, the information we're providing isn't exhaustive. There's so much more to be said, and there's just not the opportunity to discuss things in enough detail in lectures. There's just a huge number of infectious diseases, right? It's just not possible. So the way the lectures work is I'm providing you with a good, solid understanding of the concepts and how to understand these things. And I'm providing you with the tools that you need to go out and complete these assessments, to go out and gain a more detailed, in-depth understanding of these infectious diseases through the literature. That's one of the reasons why I have the slide on the module space after each lecture, which has, so it's not a slide, it's a PDF, which is essentially a reference list for each lecture. That reference list is a list of scientific papers that you can access, that you can read, that will help you to learn more about the topics we've covered. That reference list is really an opportunity for you to access the wider literature, to delve into some outside reading. I understand the literature around these topics can be really complicated. It can be a little bit intimidating. So the purpose of the reference list for each lecture is, again, a gateway. It's an opportunity for you to step into this literature in quite an accessible way. So I'd encourage you not to rely completely upon the lecture content. If a poster is submitted and the poster itself and the audio over it are composed of only lecture content and maybe some sources that you found online, that's quite weak, really, potentially very weak. What you need to do is be using outside reading. You need to be using primary papers. You need to be using literature reviews as well, and you will be able to understand those literature reviews because of the information and understanding that has been communicated to you through the lectures. So you'll be going into the primary literature and reading about the diagnostic tests for a particular infectious disease, and you'll be reading about culture, and you'll be saying, oh, we learned about that in lectures. You'll be reading about real-time PCR. Oh, we learned about that in lectures. You'll be learning about the antibody-based detection methods. You learned about those in lectures, etc., etc. And so you're applying what you've learned from lectures to the outside literature. And that's what you need to do for this assessment. You need to do that, and then once you've understood the outside literature, you need to be pulling that into your presentation and also the poster itself. Okay, so the figures on the poster, these are really important as well. So obviously we need figures there. We've said this when we were discussing the poster itself. The figures need to be explained in the poster, so the poster needs to stand for itself. It needs to be a standalone submission, in the sense that if someone looks at the poster and reads the poster, they will understand everything. So the poster should have figure legends and titles, and they should be referred to in the text. This verbal presentation portion is an opportunity for you to discuss the poster figures further. So to further explain the figures, to provide context for the figures, to explain how and why these figures were chosen. So you say, oh, this figure demonstrates this, and it was selected for this reason. Obviously, you don't say it as clumsily as that. You don't want it to be as clunky as that, but it's going to be woven into your verbal presentation is an explanation of the figures and some extra information around the figures. Okay, so are you pronouncing scientific terms correctly? So we expect scientific terms to be pronounced correctly, really. Some terms have multiple pronunciations, which is, absolutely fine. American English and British English for some scientific terms. I know some students who are English second language have learned American English, so obviously it's not a problem if you use American English pronunciations or British English pronunciations. What I'm really getting at here is pronunciations that are so egregiously incorrect, and there's no reason for them, that they detract from the poster or they impact communication, really. So yeah, just something to think about. Please do try to make sure you're pronouncing scientific terms correctly. So are you able to expand upon points made on the poster? We've said that the poster should be, it should stand for itself, it should be understandable. And the verbal communication should be adding extra information. It should be explaining, it should be providing context, it should be providing additional discussion. Therefore, if your verbal communication doesn't add extra information, if it doesn't expand upon the poster, if you're just repeating information on the poster purely, then it's not great verbal communication. You're not quite doing what we've asked you to do. So I'd really encourage you to not do that. If you have a verbal presentation that is just relaying information on the poster, you're not expanding, you're not adding context or information, then that is likely going to be very, very weak. Okay, is the additional knowledge insightful? So insightful, this is something that we ask for quite a lot. So we ask for original insights or novel insights. What we're doing when we're asking for this is we're asking for you to apply your understanding, apply your kind of scientific mind, the critical skills that you've developed to the context of the poster, to the topic, and come up with justified, reasonable, potentially original insights. So these are perspectives that are insightful, that are valuable, that are again based in the science, and that are fueled by your understanding and by your ability to think critically. Okay, do you explain the key points made within your poster concisely? So again, you need to be explaining the poster. It's a presentation, so you need to be explaining the key points in the poster, but you need to do so concisely. You need to make room in your presentation for the evaluation, for the original insights, for expanding upon ideas. So whilst you also do need to be explaining the poster, you need to be doing that concisely. Okay, some final points here. Can you make specific calls for future research? This is super, super important. So one of the things we ask you to do on the poster itself, and also in verbal communication, is to make suggestions for future work. So this is giving a future perspective, really, and you should always have this on whether on essays and exam questions and posters, obviously, and I think most forms of assessment where you have the freedom to compose a kind of a long piece of work yourself. So you have the freedom to include suggestions for future work, and encourage you to do that. Dissertations as well, definitely in your dissertation. It's going to come towards the end, it's going to be by the conclusion, and you're essentially using your understanding to fuel specific suggestions for future work that could be done. The more specific, the better. So if you're talking about future drug candidates being developed, and these drug candidates have only been tested in cell lines, then it's valuable for you to make the suggestion that they could be tested in animal models. Okay, that's a good suggestion for future work. However, a more valuable, more specific suggestion would be to suggest potential animal models that could be used, to suggest a potential setup in a very concise way for a trial that could be done, and to justify these suggestions in the literature. That's a that's a leap forward. That is, miles further than just a suggestion of using animal models. So even though the suggestion of using animal models is a suggestion for future research, and there is value to that, if we can make that suggestion more specific and we can justify it in the literature and we can make it really insightful, then it becomes much, much more valuable. And these are the kind of things that improve your mark. Okay, can you discuss your topic in the context of biomedicine and other infectious diseases? So this context is really, really important. It's really an example of evaluation. So one of the things when you're discussing the infectious disease is, and I've kind of said this, but you need to discuss it not in a bubble, so not existing just in isolation. You also need to remember it exists in the wider context. That's one of the reasons why I've asked you to put an epidemiology section on the poster. So when you're discussing the epidemiology section, and also when you're talking about the treatment and prevention section, I think it's called, or yeah, I check in the assessment brief, I think it's called treatment and prevention or control and prevention. One of the things you should be doing is discussing strategies of prevention and control in the context of the wider world, in the context of, as I say next, real world factors like socioeconomic factors, cultural factors, geographic factors. And you'll find no matter what infectious disease you're discussing, strategies to control the infectious disease will be impacted by these real world factors. What's an example? Okay, so if we're thinking about vaccinations, if we're thinking about vaccinations as a control strategy for a particular infectious disease, there's something called the cold chain, which is the chain where we get the vaccine from where it's produced from the lab to the people who need it. These vaccines typically need to be stored at a particular temperature. If they go outside this temperature, then they can, then they're potentially not effective anymore. A lot of countries that are impacted by some particular infectious diseases are quite hot countries. Therefore, it's actually difficult to get the vaccine to the people who need it at the correct temperature, while making sure the vaccine is at the correct temperature. These things matter. This really impacts who can get the vaccine. It really impacts strategies that are aiming to make sure people can get the vaccine. And these are all things you can talk about in the verbal communication portion of the poster. So these are all things you can talk about when you're presenting the poster verbally. What I just gave you is a specific example. There's innumerable examples of socioeconomic and cultural and geographic factors that impact strategies to control infectious disease. Also strategies to test infectious disease as well. What I'm really asking you is to not compose a poster and to not present a poster in a way that ignores all of these factors. You just have to consider some of these factors. You have to evidence that you understand these factors exist and they matter. And finally, we're coming to critical discussion. And again, I've discussed this, but we really need to say it again because it's so important. You absolutely need to be discussing things critically. Just like on the poster itself, you can't just be describing information. You can't just be giving facts and statistics. It's just not enough because there's not much value in that. There's some value in it. There's value in being able to access the resources and find the statistics and find the information and reference the information. However, there's not enough value for you to get high marks, and to get high marks you need to evaluate the information. You need to critically discuss the information. And when we're using terms evaluate and critically discuss, we're really talking about very similar ideas. We're talking about your ability to take this information and consider it critically, to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, to apply your understanding in a way that comes up with original insights. All these ideas are overlapping. So again, we're making a distinction between descriptive and evaluative or descriptive, and the critical. Super important we have both. Please don't submit a poster with a verbal accompaniment that is just descriptive, that is just you reading off facts and information about the infectious disease. And again, there is some value in that, I do understand that. However, at level 6, it's just, that's not enough to get a good mark. It's just really not. It might not even be enough to pass if there are other failings as well. What you need to be doing is critically discussing and evaluating the poster in as much depth as you can, and in a way that demonstrates your original insights as best you can. So to summarize in a single sentence, we can say that for this portion of the assessment, you must evidence that your understanding of the poster content is clear and comprehensive, and that your knowledge of the topic as a whole is detailed, nuanced, critical, and has significant depth. And what we mean by your knowledge of the topic as a whole is really your understanding of the infectious disease you have chosen, your knowledge of the infectious disease you have chosen. And again, as a whole, we mean that includes context. And you can see the bit at the end here: detailed, nuanced, critical, and having significant depth. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. I really do think it was. I really do think this will be helpful to you as you're putting the assessment together. If anything I've said hasn't been clear, or you'd like me to expand upon it, please do send me an email or send me a Teams message anytime. It's absolutely fine. This won't be the only support I'll be providing for the assessment. As I said, I'll be looking at individual drafts, one for each student, and I'll also be putting up a separate video in which I look through some examples of posters that were submitted in past years, and I'll be discussing the strengths and weaknesses of these posters. Okay, thanks very much everyone. Take care.